Hi, everyone. I'm John Nein. I'm one of the senior programmers. I'm just going to welcome our speakers up to the stage. You're here at Cinema Café, which is supported by Audible. Thank you, Audible. It's also Volunteer Thursday, and the volunteers got you in here, have been helping you around town, making sure you're going to the right theaters. Let's hear it for the volunteers. I want to thank our guests for coming today. I think you know them and you know their work, so I'm not going to do a deep dive into their resume, but Dee Rees, who first came here with a short, Pariah, in 2007, went through the feature film program labs 2007 to 2009. Her films Pariah, Mudbound, and Last Thing He Wanted have all played here. She's also done a number of work in episodic, the film Bessie, and has been really a part of the Sundance family throughout her career. Debra Granik also came here with a short film, Snake Feed, in 1997, has also gone through the feature film program labs, and has brought the feature films Down to the Bone, Winter's Bone, Leave No Trace to the festival, and then this year is here both with Conbody versus Everybody, and is also on our US Dramatic jury. Thank you both for coming. So the interesting thing about Cinema Café is that when we put these things together, we do it a little bit intuitively and just like, let's put them together, and that seems right. And then when I started thinking about what we might talk about today, it becomes very apparent that there's so many fascinating overlaps in their career, and so I would like to kind of go through some of those. And it starts with the beginning of your artistic careers, the early stages, when you both studied at NYU, and you both separated by almost 10 years, I guess, but you brought student shorts to Sundance, work that you had made there, Snake Feed in 97 and Pariah in 2007. And I wanted to start by asking you about the experiences of film school at NYU and how you feel that created, shaped you creatively, allowed you to explore your voice, maybe allowed you to encounter different kinds of work, both from your peers and from the filmmakers whose work spoke to you. And also, maybe most importantly, the idea of mentorship, because you've each talked about that in various ways. So could you talk a little bit about, maybe Debra, starting with you, your experiences at film school and what that meant to you?
I think the first thing that comes to mind is learning about every crew position, right? Like learning sort of what it takes, and you're very rapidly disabused of the idea that it's all about a director or producer, that it's there's no really definitive and excellent final word on how collaborative film is. You just have to I think filmmakers just have to keep saying it, and film school at its most rudimentary training ground level instills that and makes you kind of excited about the different skill sets and things that have to happen for a film to get created. And I think on the level of exposure to storytelling from around the world, I was very fortunate to have a filmmaker that did not grow up and come of age and make films in the United States. And so he pulled out of his big attaché case of DVDs, or could have, no, it was not VHS tapes, okay?
I saw you going.
Yeah, I know. I was like, there were like, the first year there were like CD-ROMs, okay? So he pulled out these films, that I had not been exposed to, and simultaneously was saying that documentary research was going to be the key to all narrative filmmaking from his training. And so, he would say, okay, I'm experiencing a problem. I'm experiencing a cultural problem here. A lot of kids are coming directly from other forms of education right into a grad film program, and I feel like sometimes we don't, he's like, I'm sensing sometimes American students don't get enough exposure to other facets of life, whatnot. So he's like pulling these things out, and he's like saying, okay, I'm gonna show you a love story that has to, a love scene that has to do more about the malfunctioning of the window shade than anything else, than anything that they get into business with or what's happening in the bed, And sure enough, he shows, Milos Forman's film, and, a young couple's trying to like get some traction and get some heat going and make it happen. And the shade goes up, and the young man has to get out of bed in his little skinny body and pull the shade down, and thus it goes. Every time they start to, the shade pops up and comes down, right? So he's like, I'm just saying that was like really eye-opening. I had seen a very, he mentioned, guys, I want to say, I think some of your sex scenes here in this country are like really airbrushed. There's nipple riders, there's things taped to people, there's things, things have to be bleeped out. I don't see the foibles and the tenderness. I don't see the, so much of what's meant to happen, has to happen between the ears, and not make it like a simulation. And so I'm just saying, that's a big immersion. That's, I'm an American, I'm socialized in this country, and I'm getting immediately immersed in the ways that people around the world are attempting to tell stories about human experience.
Yeah, and you've spoken about neorealism within that formative experience, and it feels to me like in making Snake Feed, the way that you approached it with how you intertwined what was real and what were inflections of real characters feels very much like it belongs to that. So do you want to talk a little bit about how that those influences sort of came to bear in Snake Feed?
Sort of aligning myself with social realist filmmaking. Yeah. I think maybe other social realist filmmakers would agree. You don't know that you're going to be doing that. I think, but there might be something a little bit predetermined. Clearly, there are synapses in everyone's brain that get turned on by various things. And, of course, my brain, there is a buffet table, right, in film. There's sci-fi, there's magical realism, there's about 12 big steam plates, of genres. And you don't know that your brain's gonna be like observational, how do people really do it? But it came a little bit also out of my training before film school. I was a working filmmaker who was doing educational films and training films. I was working with trade unions. So I was getting sort of the Mike Lee aspect first, which is like watching people do their work. And it was my job to photograph them at work. And then, but of course the curiosity is what happens after, at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, when you get off, when you clock out, what do you do? I always wanted to know that, but that wasn't my job. So that actually was one of the things that led me to film school. Like, I want to also be able to tell the story about what people do after they clock out, on the evenings and the weekends. And so you got to get with people, and you've got to find people that are willing to allow you to make some of that photographic study with them. The term life model, used by other filmmakers, especially, some revered French filmmakers, the idea that someone's going to inform you. If you're trying to write something that says, I would like to try to depict a story of the precarious progression of being sober, starting from day 21. They've already had a couple weeks by themselves, but day 21, day 22, day 23. I can't write that. I've not lived that. I'm going to have to find someone who's willing, who's a storyteller in her own right or his own right, and permit me to ask, what's hard today, or what are you going to try to do today, or what are your kids asking of you today? Do you think you can do that? Is it going to work? What's your strategy? Can I follow you? Could I stay with you today? And so social realism, you have to get past the fact that you might have to be also voyeuristic, because it is experiences that you're asking people to share with you that you may not know about at all. But you're going to be brought outside of the narrow path in which you were born. You're born into one body. You're usually born into one, you're born into one gender, and then that might change, but the fact is, race, ethnicity, your social class, these are all delimiters, right? These are the things that you know, and this is the path you travel. If you're gonna jump off that path and ask someone else, what is your life like? And is there any chance that, given that you're a storyteller as well, that you might wanna be in a dialogue with me? And that's it goes.
Dee, your experiences at NYU, what brought you there, the kind of mentorship and peer influence and also formative work?
Yeah, so for me, I think the thing I most took from NYU was, it's funny, the opposite of Sundance is very much a emphasis on results, you know, and the labs are all about process. And also, I think like stamina and like, you know, resilience, you know, to critique in a way. So at NYU, I mean, like Debra said, you're doing every part of the process, you're crewing for other people's films, but even before you get to making your kind of semester project, like every week you're doing an exercise. And because you're, you know, you don't have money, so you're using up all your friend's stock, you're using your friend's apartments, your apartments, the bodega owner is like, oh, can we just like grab a shot outside real quick, you know? And so like a lot of like convincing people and like currying belief. And like, you know, there's nothing worse than like being in the editing lab and like you're printing out your DV cam and like, you know, that shit doesn't work. But you know, but you got to hand it over to your professor and it's going to go in and you're going to screen it with all your 20 other, you know, directing classmates and everyone's going to watch everyone's like exercise and you're just like waiting for your DV cam to come on like, man, like, you know. So I think, you know, it kind of really instilled in me this idea, like, where are you putting the camera and why? And I had this producing teacher, Bob Nixon, and his whole thing was like, figure out what you need to show me and show it to me. And like, that's it. And it doesn't matter that the burritos were late or that this one car wouldn't move or that whatever. It's like, did you make the scene work, you know? And so I think that was one of the big things like I learned. And then when you get to the bigger semester stuff, like we had to do like a short doc. And then we had to do, which you know, made us have to go out into the city and like really talk to people and like connect with people. Like my first year doc was like on this dry cleaners on my corner in like Fort Greene that were closing. And I remember, like, I was working with this woman, Joanne Levy, who I thought was this amazing cinematographer. And you know, it was us in this dry cleaner shop, like, working with this older couple, and come to find out the guy's, like, this old doo-wop singer. And so it taught me how to ask questions, you know, and, like, the thing that you think you're telling the story about sometimes is not what you're telling the story about at all. And I benefited from the tutelage of, like, professors like Ron Gray, Sandy Sissel. My favorite writing professor was Mick Casal. And I think, like, for me, like, you know, the writing part of the program is where I kind of found my roots, and, like, the technical stuff will get beat into you, but just kind of like you find those professors that get you, that, you know, want you to win, and, you know, key into them.
Even though we were different years, the faculty that you're mentioning were also very, very prominent and important in the years I was there. And I failed to mention that my mentor was Boris Fruman.
In bringing your short films to Sundance, it's in the video that we were playing for the history of the festival. Somebody says, you know, the idea of what was going to happen, that sense of anticipation very early on in your career. Like when you came here with Pariah, there had been a good 15 years of a really solid movement building an independent film. When you came here with the short, what did you feel was your sense of what was going to happen, or what you wanted to carve out as a place to keep safe? Like, this is what I want in my career, this is where I'm willing to compromise, this is where I'm, you know, like, what was your sense of how you wanted to meet the industry that is going to enable your work?
Well, ironically, when we first submitted Pariah to Sundance, we got rejected. So it didn't actually get into Sundance the first time around. I think we actually submitted to Pariah in 2006 or 2005, maybe even. And so we got rejected from Sundance, but we continued to kind of work the queer festival circuit and like Outfest. And then I think it was like the LA Film Independent. That was the first big festival to like program us, yeah, and to not ghettoize us in like the Gay Shorts program. And then after that, I did the Screen Artists Lab in 2007. And then Directors Lab in 2008, and then I think we got into the film festival proper. And so from that experience, I kind of learned, like, okay, you know what? If you don't get the, you know, the kind of laurels, the thing I wanted to get out of it was the audience connection. So it's like, oh, well, you know what? Pariah kind of had this groundswell, grassroots support, and so I'm just going to keep kind of keying into that. And it's like the queer festival support of us, the black festival support of this. So just kind of key into that, and now Sundance is mainstream, so I had kind of no expectation. I kind of thought, like, no one's going to get it, you know, but we're here, so whatever.
And
But going back, like maybe that idea that the movement had been evolving and queer cinema had been evolving to a certain degree, but like, where did you feel like your voice still, there was a unmet appetite with the audience, but also just creatively, like, people who come before you, there were certainly new queer cinema in the 90s, but very few filmmakers of color, Cheryl Dunye maybe. Like, where did you feel you fit into something that hadn't quite been articulated in the cinema culture?
I think for me, I viewed Pariah less in the context of previous queer cinema culture and more in the context of queer literature. And so for me, it was like Audre Lorde, it was like Alice Walker as a womanist. So for me, it was kind of like bringing that black queer womanism that kind of like held me in literature and books and kind of like bringing that feeling, to a different form.
Both of you going through the lab process to develop essentially feature versions of your short films. What was that process like? Do you remember which scenes you shot or which moments of guidance or input from advisors were catalytic somehow? Like, what are your one or two most impressions that you took away from the lab?
Robert Redford kneeing me in the rear and just saying, like, yeah, you got to try a different take, because the telephone in the scene was being slammed down. Oh my God, were there telephones? Okay. And I was thinking, he pulled me aside and he's like, do you think there's any other way that this scene could be directed? Like, could there be different action there? And I said, I think it would be very interesting to try that if the phone is put down very softly, even though the person's under duress and very upset. And he's like, yes, exactly. Now go out there and do that. Even though the actor was feeling really good about slamming the, you know what I mean? Like that was an expression of their force at that moment. That was the way for them to have physicality, for high emotion. But he definitely, he's like, this is the moment. Yes, the actor's saying they like that, so you have to learn how to swing both ways. You've got to learn how to do a take where you give them the opportunity to express what they would really like to do in the scene, and then you have to ask for something that you'd like to see in the scene, and make sure that both people are, to the best of your ability, getting satiety from working the scene. And so that was very, very, very indelible and helpful. And, the whole, you talked about permission to fail in a laboratory and how it goes against the grain of film school. And permission to fail, that I don't even like that wording. I'm just saying that you were going to learn as much from something that did not work out as you were going to learn from the way that maybe the actors just got it right, and you maybe had nothing to do with the way that they got it right. But sure as heck, if there's something went really wrong, you were going to learn from that. And you wouldn't do it in your film. When you finally get a chance to make a film, you most likely, you truly have absorbed that. So the lab is the really beautiful conception of idea of rehearsal, And I've already conjured this today, that I know that one of the reasons for creating it was to reinstate the process of rehearsal and trial and error and incubation into filmmaking. So it wasn't just the hectic schedule and a person with an entourage pulling up, sauntering onto set, kind of calling, whatever, I don't want to use these cliches, but doing what they think might be okay, but their schedule is also sort of simultaneously as present as the work, or their outer, so it was a way to like reinstate the fact that there could be some insularity to growing a project, a film, a story.
Yeah, I was just at the labs a couple weeks ago in this January part of the screenwriters labs, and I remember, I think one of the things, it's funny, I don't remember so much what my mentors at the labs said to me. I remember just them looking at me. And so for me as an artist, it was the first time they're looking at me and they're reading the script seriously and they're taking me seriously. And so for me, I think just being witnessed is like a big part of what the labs do. Sometimes you just need that witness to keep going. So for me, like Pariah was like, you know, my thesis film project and is actually an excerpt of the feature because it's always gonna be a feature. And so, you know, if it didn't work out, I was probably gonna be answering the phones at CAA or something because I didn't have like, there was no backup plan. It was like, this has to work. So it was really hard for me in this moment where like, this is like high stakes, this has to work. But no, just relax and do the process. And I was like, no, this has to work. And I think the environment itself kind of helps with that because like you're shooting like in these log cabins. And so of course it's like, it almost forces you to like let go of like result and be like, okay, this log cabin obviously isn't Brooklyn, you know, nothing's gonna match. And like the snow isn't gonna match like you're seeing, but like, so now just focus on like the performances, just focus like on the blocking, like and the dynamics. Yeah. And for the director's lab, one of the things they challenge you to do is to shoot 2 or 3 scenes that you're most afraid of. And so in this lab, I remember I was really afraid of the confrontation scene with Alike and her father. And in the short, it's her father who does the violence. And in the lab, we're doing the scene, and it's not working. And I'm like, why is it not working? And I think the actors are being resistant. And I realized, you know what? He's not being resistant. It's not working because it's not in this character to do this. Like, it's the mother who should do it. And so that shaped it when I went back and rewrote the feature. I'm like, it's the mother, you know, the Kim Wayans character is the one who hasn't experienced touch. It's her who's going to reach out for touch, even if it's like negative touch. And so I think it kind of opens up the material in that way and lets you kind of, you know, really kind of work with your actors in a way that helps you maybe get a deeper understanding of the characters.
I want to ask you a question that I recognize is very difficult to answer and articulate, and yet I think it's kind of this fascinating part of directing as it relates to directing actors, and you both you know, have directed such exceptional performances, and it's about casting. And so I wonder if you could put into words the thing that is almost impossible to put into words, which is how you come to some kind of intuitive understanding that you are casting the person who is right. And I think, you know, Debra, you have cast actors who have given those breakout performances that we were talking about earlier, Vera Farmiga, Jennifer Lawrence, Thomasin McKenzie, and Dee, so many award-winning performances, both from the standpoint of discovery and then also from the standpoint of maybe rediscovering a person's, you know, I'm thinking of Mary J. Blige and Queen Latifah, like, what is that thing how do you approach the casting process in your mind in terms of what you are looking for? Or is it literally just, you know, it's such a hard thing to ask because it does feel so intuitive, but how do you put it into words?
Well, I mean, it's funny. Honestly, for Bessie, Queen Latifah, it was her film. She cast me.
Right. Fair.
So that was like a weird dynamic to walk into. Like, oh, you know, she hired me. Like, okay. But then how do I still work to gain that trust, you know? And so we still were able to find that trust. And it's about like, you know, I had only done Pariah at the point when I did Bessie, and I was initially hired to be like the writer, and then she hired me like as the director. And so basically, and Lynn Amato, shout out to Lynn Amato, you know, he used to be at HBO. He was the one who also took the shot in Mike Lombardo. But I think as a director, you still have to kind of hold that kind of like, it's like an openness, but still like a knowing. And so, you know, I didn't get to cast Queen Latifah, but I got to cast around her. And even with her, I wanted to use that kind of inherent quality, you know, of who she was to put that in Bessie, you know, in terms of like, seeing Bessie as someone who doesn't like walk around and avoid things. She like walks through things, you know? And I think that Dana like has that quality of like kind of like just moving through things, you know? But then everybody loves her. And so just trying to harness that. And then casting around her, funny enough, like in the auditions, I had auditioned Divine Joy Randolph, and I was like, holy shit, she's amazing, you know? But we needed like, you know, in terms of the studio of it all, you know, they wanted like another star. And so then Monique was like, okay, well, like Monique can also do this, you know? And then she satisfies like, you know, the HBO need for like, you know, a bigger cast. But I think you just kind of know when I like to do auditions in person, and like, you know, in the room, and I think like letting the actor have the first take, like even in auditions, because you see their natural, like what their take on the material was, you know, and then just giving them some direction, even if it's perfect, just to see if they'll take direction, just to see if they'll listen to you, or, you know, how fast they can process that. So,
but like for someone like Mary J. Blige, it's interesting because at least from probably most people's standpoint, the public persona is so outward and extroverted, and yet that character is so inward and contained. So like, you know, you must bring some intuitive sense that that's there somewhere.
Yeah, no, with Mary, I wanted her because she has this, for me, like this like observer quality, and so she strikes me as an observer. And so I wanted Florence to have this kind of like I see but I don't say kind of thing happening inside. And so she had that, and again, she had to trust me and go there with like, you know, de-glamming, and she was like amazing to work with, and she was like, you know, she was not Mary on set. She was like Florence. She came to work. She was ready, knew every line and just body language. Because I think, especially with her and with Dana, like it's funny when you work with people who are musical performers, they're already in persona. Like they know how to be a character because that's not who they are. And so it's just then inviting them into being a different character. And so, yeah.
So, and Debra, the performers that I mentioned, like what was that process, and do you have some sense of what you were looking for in auditioning and or considering, you know, those people who ended up being just incredible discoveries?
I just want to comment on something you mentioned about the process of having the actor do the first, you know, just bring what they also want to bring, and I felt like that's also something stressed at the lab, you know. In my version of the lab, there was a woman, Joan Darling, who was so important to the lab at that time, who used to like to make sure we left the lab feeling that commitment or something. But I think I was thinking a moment in the audition for Down to the Bone with Vera Farmiga, and you know, sometimes there are things that someone brings that you have to, well, you realize could be an immense help to the film. She was living at the time in the location where we were going to film. That wasn't her town of origin. She was from Jersey, but it was upstate New York. And there were some details that she gave in a little bit of a side discussion we had that I was like, oh my, this person really knows this landscape. This person really has met a lot of people in the neighboring villages. And then before we so that was extremely helpful for me. She was able to visualize some of the same places I was visualizing in the script and trying to depict. And then I was going to say that she permitted a kind of like, let's meet for half a day up in my neck of the woods. And then the sort of the gold started to pour in. You know, she was just so ready to walk into the boots of the person that was, you know, that the script was written about. And she was so willing to do boots on the ground research. You know, it's like this willingness. You're being told by this actor that they also want to be a collaborator in embodying the role. And that happened with Jennifer as well. You know, she was unknown to me. It was a regular audition process. And then in the second audition, she made it clear that she came from the neighboring state, that though the dialect was not the same, and though she was starting to live in Los Angeles, she had kin that knew something about that part of the country. And so that's a big, huge plus for me. Thomason did the same thing. Actors who were willing to do the boots on the ground research, immerse, stay there a minute, make contact with local people that they'll be interacting with in the film, and that is something that if I get that sign, I won't always get it, right? I mean, a lot of actors that are living very busy professional lives, first of all, that technique may not interest them at all, and second of all, may not be able to accommodate anything like that. But in terms of knowing that maybe I could try to, that I can rest a film on someone who's going to be on almost every scene, those three women made that very clear in the audition interaction.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, Vera's amazing. I cast her for my short in Electric Dreams, is when I did a Philip K. Dick adaptation, and I needed somebody. She played this role called the candidate, and I wanted this androgynous kind of fearsome figure that's gonna be kind of styled like David Bowie. And Vera was so game, just I remember the meeting. I was like, okay, I want you to have mismatch eyes and someone who could be this kind of avatar of everyone's fear, of everyone's hopes at once. And so Vera is amazing to work with for sure. Yeah.
Bringing up what you just said about a connection to place, it's kind of a good segue to writing, because I want to ask you a little bit about your approach to adaptation. But there's also in many of your works a really distinct sense of place, more so than, I suppose in some way you can say that's true of a lot of work, but it's really integral to the narratives. And I wonder, both from the standpoint of how it is that you're developing that in your actors, but also in your writing. This notion of place and how you familiarize yourself and how you integrate the smallest of details that are so important. Dee, in some ways, I feel like it's not just the place, it's also the sense that place is home, and that there's something so integral to that in terms of the characters. So what is the role of place and setting in your work?
For me, I think if the physical world can somehow mirror the character's internal world, is when it's most interesting. And so when I'm looking at locations, it's not just about kind of like the literal, place where it happened. It's about like the feeling, like the mood, the atmosphere. And so I think sometimes if you can kind of create that atmosphere, create that mood, I'm trying to mirror something that's happening in the protagonist, so that without saying a word, without it being a line of dialogue, we kind of get like where their head's at, what they feel, what they smell, and what they're agitated about.
For the stories that are set in the South, and you being from Tennessee, do you feel like there's a part of you that wants to explore what it means to be telling Southern stories? I mean, I know there are obviously works that are not that, but for those ones for which it's a really important part of the fabric of the story.
Not necessarily. I think maybe what I take from being, raised a Southerner and being like, one of few black families on a mostly poor white block was like feeling like, how hostility can kind of be built into the landscapes, So I grew up, there's a lot of Confederate flags around, and like learned at an early age, okay, you see that flag, don't go there, So, in stories that aren't about the South, like how can you make a building feel hostile? How can you make a world feel uninviting? And so, actually, at the labs where I met my production designer, Inbal Weinberg, who's like incredible. And so, Inbal is the production designer who's not just about layering; she's interested in building like mood and inside out kind of like feeling. And so, I like when we approach like designing spaces. It's more than just like, okay, getting this table right and this cup and this chair. It's like making this a nest, or making this a place where nothing's comfortable, like where nobody can where no one can rest. So I kind of approach production design and like locations like from that kind of standpoint.
So talking a little bit more about writing, and particularly adaptation, because a lot of your work is adapted from literature. By the way, both Oscar nominated for their work, Winter's Bone and Mudbound. But from the standpoint of approaching literature, which is, a vastly expansive form, right, in which there are always going to be things that can't be contained. It also, in the cases of both your films, I think has different narrative points of view, perspectives, Mudbound being told by various characters. How do you approach, and just the idea of, I'm sure what must be a very, strong connection to you, that literature has for you and what it can be, and yet then the idea that you have to change it in order for it to be cinema. So what is your starting place with, and I know you work with Anne, what is your starting place? What are the things that you tell yourself you have to do in order to make those adjustments?
From script to screen?
Yeah, from page to screen, I guess you can say.
No, I think there's so many things that a novel, right, we filmmakers talk about this, right, there's so many things that a novel can do that can't necessarily translate directly. Some of that is about the internal world and internal thoughts, unless the film is going to have truly extensive conveyance of those internal thoughts. There are going to have to be some other ways to give some of that information. And I think that was something in the literature that I've done adaptations with that was something I had to explore right out of the gate. Sometimes the process is just transcribing all the scenes in their action, right? And asking myself, what scene needs something more explained or context that can't just be derived from what either the dialogue that's exchanged or the actions that are performed, or and that's where some of the that's where a prop can come in, right? I mean, you can tell somebody something very important about backstory through a prop, and so that's the puzzle and the fun of saying, well, everyone will know that her father played that instrument if she finds that instrument in his closet, right? So without having to ever say, I know that my dad, when he was younger, really got pleasure from this or that, back in the day, you don't have to say that. So that's something fascinating, but kind of like, I was thinking like Reba's story, that you're trying to find signs and symbols and to convey larger ways that we explain things. And that, then I quote this beautiful, I botched this, I can't believe I don't know it yet, but it's a quote from Claire Denis, who says, so much of what filmmaking and photography is trying to convey what words can't explain. She's talking about lighting. She's talking about the fact that if you see two kids walking down the street and it's very overcast and they're solemn, you just know something about where they're at, and you start to walk alongside them more. So it's like the space, the novel tells you much, and maybe the film has to give you space to enter. So there's some almost like they're creating some of the voids and silences through images, props, objects, color, lighting, photography. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when I'm reading for adaptation, I think I take a lot from pace. So the last thing you wanted, like with Didion has this like dot, 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 dot. You can feel the cortisol, like rat-a-tat pace, like you shot out of a cannon. It's jerky, it's tense, it's like, And with Mudbound, there's like a torpor that wanted to be in the story. And so then you're figuring, okay, translating torpor by taking this passage that has nothing to do with moving the narrative forward, but it's about like dead things, and saying, okay, this needs to be in the story, because once you understand that death is casual here, you'll understand the world of these characters, and you'll understand the casual violence, you'll understand the casual death and decay. And so I think as a writer, you're keeping in mind that what reads long will sometimes be short. So when you say, a dead possum sinks into the mud, a line of ants traps inside of his eye socket, nearby, blah, 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 that seems blocky, but that's 3 seconds on screen. And so I think the challenge is like writing for like the reader versus writing for yourself as a director, just reminding yourself what you want to see like on the screen. And sometimes you have to do a dance because the producer will say, oh, write down the page, this is too blocky. But you're like, no, that's like a 1 second shot. But I just have to describe like what's on the screen, So I think trying to figure that out is the challenge of the adaptation.
I want to ask also about, I guess in a way this is about the relationship between art and life as we see it, which is that so many of the films that you've made deal with incredibly complex, entrenched, structural drama, and therefore the resolution to that is very difficult, right? So I'm thinking of addiction, racism, trauma, socioeconomic, poverty, etc. Those are not things that narrative finds that easy resolution towards. So I just wonder, when you think about, whether you are writing or whether you are making the film, and trying to find that way for which there is resolution for the audience for something that is so difficult. And I'm thinking, specifically of, I'm just overwhelmed every time I see the end of Mudbound, because it feels like that is an effort to try to do something that deals with resolution for something for which there is no resolution.
You have to give credit to Virgil Williams for that ending, the ending where Ronzel rises, from the dead. So in filming it, I wanted to misdirect. So I wanted the audience to think, okay, he's in a coffin, they're moving away, at least taking his body, and at least taking their agency and like getting a new space, getting some land. And then, in the way we shot it, in this kind of like third-person POV. And so you think you're kind of in the world, and then he walks into his own POV to show, oh, he's actually alive. So, I think it's just about like allowing the possibility for a change. It's like not saying that things are going to be easy or things are going to be better in that, or in Pariah when she leaves on the bus. It's not saying things are going to be easy or better, but there's just the possibility that things might be different. So,
yeah, I think American, one thing I learned, one of the big things I learned about, other countries' filmmaking is that there's a huger tolerance for nihilism, in other cultures, and we really, we're the country that has "Have a nice day" on our plastic bags, or did, before we tried to control the plastic bag. But that as an American storyteller, I find it hard not to actually look for some. I don't want it to be corny and trite and packed out, wrapped up, but I'm always looking, what is some tiny form of escape hatch or some mutual aid or somebody that cares about that person? What is the small fragment that could allow that person to get to the next stage of their existence, hopefully intact,
Another area, I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and I'm going to take questions from you all. But again, looking at these kind of interesting overlaps, you both have written characters who are veterans, who have suffered trauma in conflict, and that leads to maybe also a way in which you are thinking about violence in your work and the potential for violence. But and Debra, it's like not, Leave No Trace. It's such an interesting version of that because it's so contained. Stray Dog. This notion of a veteran experience as well too. Like maybe if you could just talk about what it is that both drew you to that, whether you're the originator of that work or obviously it's a character in a book, but like this notion that you're wrestling with veterans of war and the trauma of that.
Do you want to go first? And the film that we finished and that's here is dealing with veterans of a different war, which is the carceral war, the war of mass incarceration, the war on over-policing poor communities or urban communities. So that's a war that has veterans, and I really got steeped in the parallels, just that the camaraderie, the notion that people understand people really well who've had a very similar experience in the carceral system, but I am interested in mutual aid. I am interested in the way that someone who's had a shared experience can understand something about you that the general population cannot, and that you need that understanding, especially if trauma is involved, especially if you need to not be judged or summarized, or especially if you need someone to greet you and say top of the morning, as a way to like let you know that they know like a greeting that might actually comfort you in the morning. I would say I love people that try to reach out and see if they can pull someone in to their journey forward, and veterans do that, But I also think veterans make us look at our society in very interesting ways, because we in order to understand what cohorts of people who've had shared experience, and if we've not, they're going to allow us to, they're going to reflect back to us things, and it's going to take a bunch of them to give their version of it, things that we don't know firsthand. And so it's about transmission of firsthand experience that you haven't had, and frequently it's you need a lot of people to be willing to share that. I think that was a big plus in our actual military veteran and combat veteran culture and understanding, was that the acknowledgement of PTS was a breakthrough in our society, and it has been for urban trauma and carceral trauma as well. It was just, we're not there yet with the carceral trauma. We don't acknowledge that the same hypervigilance that someone performed to save their life when they were in a turret of a tank is the same same physiological hypervigilance that you have to perform to make sure that you stay alive during your prison sentence. But yeah, so I think it's about transmission of potent firsthand experience that most of us can't have unless we're in that cohort.
What's the question?
Well, just about what interest you take in depicting lives and experiences of veterans of conflict, and maybe Bloodbond is the most pronounced version of that. It's an incredibly compelling part of the film.
Yeah, for me, and Masters of the Air, which is coming out tomorrow. So yeah, I think for me, I'm interested in like the battles at home and how they reflect on the battles abroad in a way. And so actually, there's a Toni Morrison book called Home that I had optioned like a while back and had written on spec. that I couldn't get made, but it's about a veteran of the Korean War. And it's like a similar thing where he had fought in Korea, was coming back, and was like actually avoiding going back home, you know, because he didn't want to deal with that, you know, with the Jim Crow. And so I think I'm interested in who gets to be a patriot. I'm interested in like what that looks like, you know, after, you know, the kind of after the media goes away, after like the kind of press narrative has been written. For me personally, like both my grandfathers were veterans, like on my mom's side, World War II, and on my dad's side, the Korean War. And so the one who went to the Korean War got to be a janitor when he got home, and the one who went to World War II got to be a postman when he got home. So at the time, you know, like, oh, these are good jobs for you, you know, but I like, you know, the idea that, you know, on one side of the ocean you're a hero, on the other side you're a janitor. And so kind of I feel like that story hasn't been told, and so I'm interested in getting into that and kind of complicating this idea of patriotism and like, you know, who should be like really like waving flags, you know, like my family has just as much right to wave the flag, but we don't, you know, and like why don't we, and maybe we should, so yeah.
Last quick question, and then I'm going to open it up. The presence of violence in films and your thoughts about it's presented, I think, in both of your works as a function of the dynamics of power and around race, gender, sexual orientation, and I wonder how it is that you think about its depiction in like what it is, I mean, that you feel you want to show and not show, and just how it is that you think about the notion of violence as it, you know, is expressed in any number of your films.
I think it's funny. I think for me, I think it's just whatever serves the story, whatever serves the character. You know, the scope and the lasting effects, you know, to me has to be commensurate with like whatever story you're telling. But I do think, you know, there's a way in which you can be more realistic in that the effects can linger, you know? So it's like, it's not like, bang, somebody shot, and 2 weeks later they're up and they're fine. I like showing the kind of lasting scars, you know, of it in a way. And I had an interesting experience with Mudbound, because people were saying they couldn't watch the Lynch, saying, oh, it's too hard, it's too violent. But you can watch John Wick, you can watch Reservoir Dogs, you can watch, you know, any number of ultra-violent films, you can watch Clockwork Orange, no problem. So I'm interested in the ways in which realistic violence is unpalatable, but cartoonish violence or like ultra violence is palatable and challenging audiences, and like what we're able to like hold our gaze on. So yeah.
I'm so aligned with you because, you know, I feel like, whatever, again, some things are predetermined, right? I can't tolerate much about the woundable body of another person, you know, getting hurt. You know, it's like, I can't tolerate much. I can't let into my hard drive a lot of violence, especially if it's done in, like as a joke. You know, killjoy I may be, but you know, my body will not laugh at it, you know, and so I was always thinking like complicating violence, like where does the bullet go? We're slap happy, we're a gun maniac culture, and sorry, I just feel very sensitive about it because a lot of people that you know I've worked with have paid a very big price for the ease with which a gun could be involved in their life, and you know, I always think the guns can't go off in my films, you know, or if they go off, it's got to be super problematic. Everyone needs to know where that bullet went, all the organs it hit, the way that it wrecked the family, the way that the mother hurt, the way that life was snuffed out. You know, it has to be complicated. In a country that is glib about violence and where we experience it at levels, even it attacking the most exquisite person in the Sundance Institute, taking down the life of her son this year. It has to be so complicated. It's like, I remember at NYU, the year I was in, a bunch of us started a little like, within our class, a little petition or a little like sign on, a movement. Can we all take a vow to not put in our damn student films, could we restrain ourselves? Could we not use a gun to solve a problem or to make a joke out of it or to have someone pull it out or have it be the Deus Ex Machina, you know, have it be. And I was like, you know, and so people said, half the class, first of all, it was the first year they had 50% women. And, you know, half the class said, yeah, let's all make a short film. Let's all make a short student film without a gun. You know, so it's like, I'm a citizen of a country. I'm fully aware of what we do. You know, I'm not insulated from it at all. But I want to do, you know, the cognitive behavioral therapeutic technique of REST, rest. Like, at least if violence is going to be in there, make us pause enough to think about why it was committed, who it's harming, all its ramifications. And God, I hope I haven't been duplicitous here and like have some instant that I didn't recognize that had some violence that didn't have ramifications. But for me, the accountability is the ramifications of when someone decides they're going to wound another person, deal with the ramifications.
Thank you. All right.
I know I got overwrought, but
We have about 10 minutes for your questions. Just if you could speak loudly so that the whole room can hear you. There's a mic, sorry.
I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the editing process, being writers, and how that edit informs your final rewrite.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the edit is definitely, it's like you're like rewriting the script in the editing room. And I've been lucky to have great editors like Mako Kamitsuna, Brian Cates, and, I kind of work with the same editors over and over again because, when I'm on set, I don't watch dailies, I don't watch like cuts, I let them kind of do their thing. And, oftentimes there's a thing that can surprise you, and there's a way that you can move something that was scripted in a way that elevates kind of like a feeling. So, for example, like in Mudbound, for an example, when Laura and Jamie like hook up, initially that was kind of like before I think Pappy confronts him. I think it's scripted to be like before. And then we moved it to be like after, so it's even more defiance, because like, oh, they know about you, and we're going to do it anyway, So I think there's discoveries in the edit that you can be open to rewriting your script, and just kind of being open to whatever kind of heightens the emotion.
On this project that we just finished, I worked with an editor, and she did 6.5 hours of multi-part documentary on her own, and she was a beloved colleague and collaborator that started working on the earlier films. She came into the Winter's Bone process as an assistant and just has become a very, just a audacious editor and phenomenal processor of story, content, and beats. And we also share I have had beautiful interventions with Brian Cates. Coming in and just recently even helping tremendously with a conversation that would allow us to flip-flop something and have it work out so much better. Editors on all the projects do a lot of the writing. Tori definitely, by the way she attended to the character's growth and development, was writing what bits of the many things they said could be then conveyed in the story. But yes, the editor, I think some years it gets highlighted hugely. There's some documentaries that'll come out one year at this festival or in the history of filmmaking or a narrative, and it will be understood the level at which the editor is rewriting and writing, and it's a collaboration that is at times overly intense, because two people are trying so many things, and the editor goes home, and even though she's been working 12 hours, she has a thought on the train ride home that she's got to text you the next morning or try out. You went away and maybe did a long car drive or something, and you've had a thought, and then Monday you've got to try it. So just like, but there's also, how intense is it to like do Rubik's Cube with another person's brain, your brain, and this other person who's a wizard, and just that process, of keep turning and seeing, and then some days with some films you feel like you got those colors to align on all the sides of the cube, and you're very high after that.
And I also think there's sometimes benefit to just like trying it versus talking about it, Because
Yeah.
we can talk about it for half an hour.
Yes.
Or you can cut it together in 10 minutes and we can see it, So I think sometimes like, okay, let's not talk about it, let's just try it. And same with shooting sometimes. You can talk about a shot and debate a shot, and it's like, okay, we got time actually, like let's try both, like shoot it, cut it, because now it's digital. It's not like it's like a Steenbeck and you're gonna cut the frame and not have the frame anymore. It's like, it's digital, like we'll always have that, it lives forever. So why not just do the cut versus like talking about the cut?
Can I say that I think what you're saying for any filmmakers, the malleable can keep working and the brittle get broken, right? I mean, the ancient saying, right? And so trying it both ways is like often a way to stay malleable. Or just trying it, you know, you have, and another thing, in editing, you have to constantly say, we're just flipping and flopping at once, we can go back. You know, just by positing an idea doesn't mean you're abandoning something that was working. Frequently, you return to something that was working. So trying things both ways, swinging in both directions is a good way to be malleable.
All right, we have time for a couple more. Yes, on the aisle, and then we'll come to you.
Debra, you had just mentioned that your class at NYU was the first one to have 50% women. The Oscars recently had their nominations, and 3 out of the 10 Best Picture nominees are directed by women, but 7 out of 10 are still directed by men. What advice might you have for a young, aspiring director-writer like myself about being a woman and breaking into this industry?
I think Sundance has a better statistical rate. I think the industry can't keep up with a maverick institution that wants to do something quietly and stealthily. I mean, Satter's technique was crazy awesome. You know, she didn't tell anyone she was going to make parody in these labs decades ago, but she did, and her whole team. You know, so it's like, and she didn't, and she knew. It's interesting physics or something. If you put all these ingredients into the hopper's going to, you know, the beautiful seeds that are going to come out of the hopper are like, I don't even know if I'm using the right grain analogy here, but like, you know, you're gonna get, input matters what comes out. So if you increase the input and the access and you open the gates and you open the doors and you train women, you know, on equal, if you put the same amount of women in a boot camp as men, you're gonna emerge with soldiers of cinema that want to march together, that are in equal numbers or getting closer and closer. So the Sundance, you know, way ahead of the industry. Industry is cumbersome sometimes. It moves slowly. It's a behemoth sometimes. It has other systems at play that can sometimes destroy positive social objectives. Not destroy, but retard or hold back, right? Lookism could be a real big issue, you know, who we think is okay to put on screen, and then what happens if you've got a lot of women that want to like deviate from that? Or what if you have a whole bunch of women directors that don't want to hypersexualize young women on screen? Well, industry didn't catch up to that sometimes. They still like women, young women a lot, you know, practically desnudo, you know, like, and they don't really care so much about what's behind, you know, between their ears. They'd rather see them undress, or they think, you know, it takes cool guys like some cinema-going individual at the Seattle Film Festival to come up and say, I'm 18, but I don't need women to undress in films for them to be interesting to me. And the industry says I do, and I'm here to say I don't. So I'm saying there's a lag time there. Here's this young dude saying, I don't really need any of that, of what you're serving me to get me to come and see a film. So what you say, if you ask, did you say for like a tip? Or, okay, so a tip is do your proving grounds without industry restrictions, right? Do what Dee, you know, come, get something short that you love, that you could do proof of concept on your own terms where you're not waiting for that green light. It's not gonna serve forever. You know, you make films that require really significant, at times, budgets, you know, so I'm not trying to make this Pollyanna. I'm saying you've got to start with your own sense of what you would like to have happen before you're waiting for an invitation or trying to grovel for what a bigger system might, you know, want to offer you. And that only goes so far. Then you're going to need support and infrastructure and connectivity. But I just mean, initially, to want acceptance, I think prior to that, prove what turns you on, I think.
We have about 2 more minutes, so I'm going to take right here in the aisle second. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So I'm an undergraduate film student, and Leave No Trace is actually what made me want to go to film school, so thank you for that. It's just wonderful. And I've directed a few shorts, and where I found myself lacking is in getting kind of the right performances out of actors, and I've loved hearing what you guys have said about your different strategies. And obviously there's, you know, certain theories that are set in stone of like, try this exercise, try this, but I'd love to hear what you guys have said of what has kind of come up organically about maybe changing the story, changing who does what a certain action is, and ways you've been able to communicate with actors to get kind of the performance you wanted. So I'd love to hear more about that.
I want to just confer that I got the right, that I gleaned your question. It's about that in some of the short films that you've been making, that sometimes you feel like a disappointment or you're not sure how, that when you see a disparity between how you envision the character and what some of the ways that the actor's portraying that, like a gap that, oh boy, this is the crux of the, you know. Do you have something you want to say there?
I mean, it would require like another question back, and it's kind of like, how are you thinking about the blocking when you're preparing the scenes, and just as a writer, as a director, when you're breaking the scenes down, it's like, how do you break your scenes down? Like, do you know like where the turns are? Because when you know where the turns are, that kind of informs the action. And if you think the performances are coming out of resistance to the blocking, or is it coming out of resistance to like, you know, you're not putting emphasis in the right places. Like, how do you break your scenes down?
Sometimes I can't think of anything better to do than to repeat the line back to them the way that I would see it said, but I know that that is not always productive.
Yeah, actors don't like line reads. I mean, I would recommend that you, for yourself, do the scene analysis. And you break down the scene, and you know what the scene's about, and you know what they're saying, but what it's really about. And so this, like, can I sit here is not really saying, can I sit here? It's really saying, like, what's wrong with you? You know what I mean? And then you give the actor that. Or you direct with verbs, you know, like challenge him, like piss on your territory. And so then that actor right there, from saying piss on your territory, they're gonna walk around the room in a different way, and they're gonna piss on their territory, you know? So get direct with your verbs more, and do your own scene analysis so you know where the turns are, so you can explain what's happening versus giving line reads, you know?
Those are great. The verbs matter so much. And then, you know, you being able to discuss a little bit, not get too intellectual, not too wordy, but off the rehearsal process, you know, trying to figure out always what does your character really need in the scene? What do they really want? What do they need from the other person? What do they want from the other person? And you and the character you and the actor trying to understand that. And then, you know, the simple direction to give to anybody in any scene, just, you know, not for them to preconceive what they're going to do next, but be there, really listen and really answer. Really listen to who is talking to you in the scene and really answer them. So that those are some starting places. And then, you know, the mentor showed all these examples where, you know, with a kid, if you ask them, this is a famous one, with a kid, and let's say the kid's supposed to be experiencing something heavy. You know, you could tell a kid a whole bunch of things, and, you know, you don't want fake tears, you don't want to make them so sad, you know, like tell them, you know, the saddest thing ever. But you could say, count the floorboards, you know, and that kid with their very open, porous, you know, the face, if they count and they just keep looking, smoke and mirrors, they're looking at the floorboard and they're counting, and you're going to get the solemnity on this child's face, you know, and you're not asking them to do something so crazy. You're saying, and then you say, keep counting all the way to the other side of that room, you know, and they're going to lift their eyes, and that they're concentrating. So what you know, it's what a lot of editors even know, right? A neutral face, what the scene that comes on the side, you know, to the left of that neutral face, and what happens after is how you read that neutral face, you know? And so yeah, there are many rich things that you can do to close that gap, or to avoid them having to understand that gap so much. But you circumvent by just saying an action like what Dee said, you know, telling someone to light a fire with a wet match. That takes a lot of effort, and that's going to give someone something extremely, you know, specific they're going to take many takes. They might get upset or frustrated. I'm just saying things will grow from those kinds of experiments. I'm saying if there was a fire to be lit in your scene, I don't mean like just ask actors to come in and do these weird experiments. But but so yeah. So there, the verbs. If you even just going for the verbs, you're going to go somewhere.
All right, I'm gonna close things with adjectives, which is, I have to say, thank you so much for coming and doing this. I was intimidated to do this in a way because I find your work so incredible and impressive and rich, and it's almost like, where do you even start with trying to talk about it? But I really
good job.
appreciate your answers and your thoughtful questions, and thank you everyone for coming to Cinema Cafe.